Hey there, YouTube. Just got to make a couple of marks on here before I take this apart. Got to drill holes for the lag bolts that are going to hold this top down to the legs before I glue the legs together. And you don't normally have to do this on wood, but center punching these holes will make them more accurate. If you have a long enough drill bit, then you don't have to transfer your marks around, but I am going to have to drill this from both sides. And so it's pretty important that I have the hole in the right spot. And I'm going to make sure I'm still using the same registration face for this crosshatch, even though in theory it's exactly in the center. The secret to making drill from both sides work is square. So start square and clear the material out regularly as you drill through. These joints fit well enough that PVA glue would be absolutely fine. But because I have all of this bug damage in the wood and the mortise and tenon joints, there's usually a space at the end of the tenon, bottom of the mortise, I decided to go ahead and take the plunge, and it is a plunge, let me tell you, and invest in the West System epoxy setup. I went with the number 206, which is the slow hardener, which should give me, half hour, maybe 40 minutes even of working time in the pot. Not that I need that much, hopefully, but I want to make sure this thing is completely and totally square. So the ability to move it around a little bit before the epoxy tacks up is going to be handy. And because I'm using it for hole and or gap filling and adhesive purposes, I am going to go ahead and add a little bit of filler. I got the number 406 colloidal silica filler, which is just sort of a general purpose filler and thickener for this epoxy system. I'm going to mix up just one batch of this stuff, one pump out of each can, and I'm using, 2 teaspoons, maybe a tablespoon of filler, because I don't want this epoxy to be really thick. I want it to be able to run into the holes in the wood, but I don't want it runny. I don't want it dripping all over the place. Let me tell you, if there's a secret to this epoxy, it's this step right here. If you get it well mixed, then it will cure, in the time it's supposed to cure, and it'll be nice and strong when it's done. If you leave globs of filler in there or spots of resin that don't have any hardener nearby, all you're making is a mess. I'm actually going to pour a little bit in each of these mortises to get the bottoms coated and filled. Then for the tenons, I'm going to butter the actual tenon. One of the nice things about epoxy is that it doesn't swell wood fibers like PVA glue does. So these things that went together nicely when they were dry fit still go together nicely even with the epoxy in there. Note that the big leg mortises are still dry though. I'm not gluing them. And obviously you want to make sure that everything is nice and square. I'm making sure that mine is even square to the bench top, even though we're not attached to the bench top at this point. I just want to make sure everything's going to go together the way it's supposed to when I flip this thing over. I don't have quite enough long clamps to do both sets of these legs together at the same time, which actually is okay. It's going to let me do 2 things, doing these kind of one at a time. The first thing is a lesson learned on the epoxy. I mixed it about twice as thick this time as I did on the first set of legs. One of the 2 mortises on the first leg was a little looser than the other, and the epoxy really wanted to run out of there. So I think the thicker mix is going to be helpful. The more important thing this will allow is for me to use the first leg, which is now rock solid thanks to the epoxy having set overnight, as a template. The reality is the 2 halves of this top can be really any distance apart. Doesn't matter down to the 1/16 of an inch, except what matters is that these 2 legs are the same distance because these tops are not going to bend at all. The process for gluing up this leg is exactly the same as the process for gluing up the other one. I buttered the tenons, which was easier with the thicker epoxy, and put some in the bottom of the mortises as well. Although I did notice that the thicker epoxy made it just a little bit tougher to get the joints together, so I had to use the rubber mallet a bit more than I did on the very first one. Clamping this leg to the one that's done does a fantastic job of ensuring that they're going to come out exactly the same. But it has one little problem. These clamps are essentially along the bottom edge of this leg. And so they want to tilt it kind of out a little bit. So you do need to put another clamp on here across the top to bring it back to square. But it's only going to take just the tiniest of clamping pressure to make sure that this thing is exactly where it needs to be. And so now the joy of working time becomes the agony of waiting time. Gonna have to wait a full 24 hours for this epoxy to cure to the point where I could do something like, oh, I don't know, put a 300-pound bench top on it.
Actually, after about 8 or 10 hours, the epoxy is set up enough that it's safe to take those legs apart and stand them back up. That lets me epoxy in the long stretcher so that the final 24-hour cure can be everything all at one time.
Now, one last thing I gotta do before I can start flipping this thing over. I've got my holes pre-drilled in the stretchers, but I don't have any marks in the top, and I absolutely positively need to pre-drill in the top for the lag bolts that are gonna hold this thing together. So I have extended my drill bit to the very, very edge of the reaches of what will grip in the drill. I do not recommend that you drill a hole with your bit so barely in the chuck. But just to shove it down in here and make a quick mark on the top, it'll be fine.
Time to go vertical with the legs at long last. They're really heavy, but fortunately they just sort of roll right off the bench top and drop onto the floor.
What I've done here is I've stuck one of my bolts up through the stretcher. This is how far it's gonna go into the top. What I wanna do is I wanna mark my drill bit for, you know, plus or minus the end of this bolt here so that I can drill the right depth into the top, but really no further. Blue tape is, of course, the solution to this problem, because blue tape is the solution to all shop problems. I want these holes in the bench top to be perfectly square and vertical to the surface of the top. Otherwise, it's going to be next to impossible to get those bolts in, and they might even pull the thing kind of sideways and out of alignment. So what I've done is I've made myself a little guide block. I drilled this hole on the drill press so that I know it's exactly perpendicular to the faces of this plywood. I'm going to use this to start my holes in the bench top, and then once they're established as far in as I can get with the block in place, I'll get it out of the way so that I can then drill down to my depth flag accurately. With that much of the hole drilled with the block in place, I can drill the rest of it down to my flag and be pretty confident that it's going to stay straight.
So the key to working with something heavy like this, if you're by yourself, is try not to lift if you don't have to. Leave the heavy part anchored and roll it or lever it.
Now I have to take the sort of scary step of determining where I'm going to cut off the end of this bench to make it flush. Clearly, I'd like to keep the bench as long as possible, but this is the end that's going to have the leg vise down here. And the goal of this leg vise was to be able to have the stock clamped in the vise, but overhanging the bench so you could saw through it easily. So I'm only gonna go, I don't even know how long this is, but I'm gonna go enough outside of this leg that I can easily make the chalk of the vise wide enough to come clear out to the edge. I'm gonna put that in with a pencil line just so that I know that it's there. But then I'm gonna come back with the knife and I'm gonna score this, because I've got to cut it with a circular saw, and having a knife edge here will help sever the top fibers and will prevent tear out on the keep side of the bench.
The circular saw doesn't even come close to cutting the whole way through this bench top, but it gives me a nice straight line and cuts down on the handwork I have to do a whole lot.
End cuts on the workbench are going to get finished off with a good old crosscut panel saw, which I have to go buy because I have no idea where mine went. In the meantime, I'm going to work on finishing up this center section. I have to cut 2 little dados in the bottom of this so that it will sit down onto the stretchers that are part of the legs and sit flush on the workbench. So I'll get the depth of that groove just by using my square and setting it to the height of the protrusion above the top of the bench. And I'll duck under with my knife, make some knife lines along those stretchers.
I made very light passes with the knife underneath the workbench. Now that I'm up here on the surface, I can have a better go at it. I can use the square to mark the depth. That depth mark is really just a reference. I'm going to use the square to set the height of the dado. Okay, I got my dados cut on the two ends. Let's see how this thing drops in here. So it's just about perfect here in the center. And on the ends, I have 16ths. It's all going to come out in the flattening process for the whole bench. But it works. Anyway, I can pick it up, slide it over, and there's my bench stop. Alrighty, well, since I don't have the saw, and you guys don't want to watch that anyway, nobody wants to see sweaty, angry Matt, and I just dropped my combination square on the ground and broke the pin that holds it together, so I now have two tools to go by. I'm going to take that and the dark as a sign that it's time to quit for today. Still have to do flattening, still have to do finish, and probably going to need some hardware. That's all going to have to wait for another day. Questions or comments, leave them below. While you're there, think about hitting that sub button. And as always, stay safe, YouTube.